All right, so here are 10 must-know elections for the APUS history exam. You might see them. So, election of 1800 was between the incumbent, John Adams, who was a Federalist, and the vice president, Thomas Jefferson, because remember the loser ends up being the vice president, so he had lost, and now he's vice president, and he was a Democratic Republican, so having a vice president who's a different political party than you, terrible idea. So the major debates focused on federal power, foreign policy, as who are we going to side with, France or Britain, who is America going to be chummy with, and definitely civil liberties and the restriction of free speech because of the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts that had tried to make it hard for immigrants to vote. That was the Alien Act, and the Sedition Act making you could be criminalized for seditious libel or saying bad things about the president. So those definitely restricted the very fresh First Amendment. The election actually ended in a tie between Jefferson and his running mate, Burr. So Adams was booted out and it was between Jefferson and Burr, and it went to the House of Representatives, and that's where we get the whole Hamilton thing where he swayed people to vote for Jefferson, which is actually true, just didn't happen in rap version. And what's really significant about this, we call it the Revolution of 1800 because it's the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties in U.S. history. And it set this precedent that we can have a new leader without someone dying, without bloodshed. Opposing parties can peacefully transfer over. Also called the Revolution of 1800 because people thought that Jefferson was more of a common man. He was for the little guy, even though, he was rich. We went over this in class. Election of 1824. In 1824, we actually have 4 candidates. All of them Democratic Republicans, because this was in the era of good feelings when the Federalists had died out. It's about to switch over to the era of Jackson. So you got John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, we don't really remember him, and Henry Clay, who tried to be president a million times, never was. It split the vote. William Crawford was out, but it split the vote between Adams, Jackson, and Clay, and no one secured an electoral majority. Now, we had established in the 12th Amendment after the election of 1800 that power remains with the House of Representatives, and so it went to the House of Representatives. Jackson had won the popular vote and technically most electoral votes, but not a majority, and the House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams, inspired by Clay, who was Speaker of the House, and then suddenly the next day he's Secretary of State. And so Jackson supporters start crying farce, you cheaters, and they called it the corrupt bargain. And it basically split the Democratic Republican Party into people who were for it and people who were against it. People who were against it joined the new party called the Jacksonian Democrats. And so this showed that the era of good feelings was not actually good feeling, and it was actually very regional and sectionalist, and people were fighting over tariffs and internal improvements and federal versus state power. So, moving forward to the election of 1844, this is an, time period 5, end of 4, start of 5. And this is James K. Polk against Henry Clay. He's back and he doesn't win. Key debates is all about expansion. Should we annex Texas? Should we expand slavery? What about the Oregon border? And that's where we get the slogan 54-40 or fight, was Polk's slogan, that he was going to be a proponent of American American manifest destiny. And he supported annexing Texas and the Oregon Territory. So Clay was a little bit more cautious, and Polk kind of ends up winning this, and he begins this period of aggressive expansion, sparking the Mexican-American War, winning that whole Mexican Cession area, which is just going to start a flame of the slavery debate, which will lead us to our next election. Let's get going. Election of 1860 is, again, 4 candidates. Y'all, we just can't figure it out this time. We don't have a primary system. So Abraham Lincoln is a Republican, brand new party. Stephen Douglas is a Northern Democrat. John Breckinridge is a Southern Democrat. Very different beliefs. And John Bell was part of the Constitutional Union Party. So the primary issue was expansion of slavery, because it's going to be expansion of slavery from any time from 1830 on. The issue is slavery. So the newly acquired Mexican cession, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all of that, just like boom, 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 all these little fires are popping up everywhere about, does the federal government have the right to even limit slavery? Which technically the Dred Scott versus Sandford case in 1857 says no. But Lincoln, this is what leads to Southern secession. Lincoln wins the election of 1860 without a single Southern electoral vote, to which the South says, deuces, peace out, we're gone. And the South secedes, starting with South Carolina, and then like the domino effect. And Lincoln's election causes the Civil War. Not Lincoln himself. He was a wonderful man. So this election kind of signified the collapse of our nation as we know it. And it's going to take years of Civil War and years of Reconstruction to come back together. Speaking of Reconstruction, it ends with the election of 1876. So in 1876, we had 4 years of a Civil War and a decade of Reconstruction. Lincoln's been shot. There's been multiple presidents after that. And the country was trying to be put back together through a federal program called Reconstruction. And the Reconstruction program included the radical Republicans in the federal Congress, basically making martial law and the military in charge of the South. That was called radical or military Reconstruction. So, in the election of 1876, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes faced a Democrat, Samuel J. Tilden. And it was a big dispute because Tilden won the popular vote, but 20 electoral votes from different states were like contested. Were they real? Were they fake? The election was rigged, that sort of stuff. So a special like commission basically came together. First of all, this is like behind closed doors stuff, okay? A special electoral commission comes together and says, those 20, like, was it rigged votes? They're all going to go to Rutherford B. Hayes. Sorry. So basically giving him the presidency by one extra vote. So that one extra vote pushed him over the edge. But he promised to end Reconstruction. We call that the Compromise of 1877. So that is going to be the end of federal, like, Union troops in the South enforcing Reconstruction protections for African Americans, and that's going to usher in Jim Crow. And a decade later, we're going to get Plessy versus Ferguson, and it's just going to go back to a system where the white Southerners are what we call redeeming the Old South, and they call themselves the Redeemers. All right, 1896 is next. Republican William McKinley versus Democrat / kind of a populist William Jennings Bryan, who, again, just like Henry Clay, will run like 3 or 4 times and never become president. So the major issue of this election is so freaking boring. It's the gold versus silver debate. It's monetary policy, everybody's favorite, and some tariff stuff and some industrialization and big business. So McKinley supports the gold standard, big business, some corrupt practices, that sort of thing. Bryan appeals to farmers and laborers, and he kind of gets sold out from the Populist Party into the Democratic Party. And they advocate freeing silver and flooding our monetary system with silver to inflate the price of things to help debtors. Because if debtors pay back with inflated dollars, they're actually paying back less valuable dollars, and that helps them. So he's got this like big speech, do not crucify America upon a cross of gold. And so basically this ushers in a time where the Republicans win forever and ever, for a very long time, because William McKinley wins, and we'll have lots of Republicans after that. Okay. Election of 1912, smack dab in time period 7 in the Progressive Era. Former President Teddy Roosevelt, who'd already run 2 terms, comes back. He was president, then he was like, nah, guys, I'm not going to be president. He was vice president under McKinley. McKinley gets shot. He dies. Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, has 2 terms as president. Then he goes away because of the 2-term, precedent set, and he's like, my buddy Taft is going to be the dude, and he didn't like what Taft did, and so he comes back after a Taft president and says, I'm going to run again, y'all, don't you love me? So he's running against his former vice president and friend, Republican William Howard Taft, and a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. So the main debates are all about progressivism, female right to vote, antitrust, trust busting, those big businesses, reforming government and business, putting systems on a merit system so there can't be like nepotism or spoils system. And so the Republican Party, actually, it's called third party spoils, because President Roosevelt used to be a Republican, when he comes back as like this progressive party, I'm as fit as a bull moose, basically, like I'm big and bad is what he's saying. He splits up that Republican vote. Many people vote for Taft, many people vote for him, but not a lot of Democrats come over to his side. So third party spoils. Wilson actually wins. With a minority of the popular vote, he wins because of his electoral vote. And so this election is really significant because we get this major third party. And populism was kind of a major third party, but they kind of sold out William Jennings Bryan to the Democrats. So this is like the first time we see a major third party, and that third party spoils thing is going to hold. And it's just going to split another party, and it's going to move over to the other side. Also, it just shows the difference in progressivism. Being a progressive could mean you were part of very different parties depending on what you were in favor of, because all of these men said they were progressives in the progressive era. All right, time period 7, election of 1932. In the midst of the Great Depression, Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt defeated the incumbent Republican Herbert Hoover. Hoover was kind of seen as someone who only helped big business during the Great Depression, that he wasn't trying hard enough to help the regular American. Homeless people had named their homeless villages after him, Hoovervilles. So economic recovery, unemployment, should the government intervene, those were all the central issues, and FDR promises to bring a new deal to Americans. And that really resonated with people who were starving, with people who need to feed their children, with farmers who couldn't pay the bills, who had no crops, with banks and businesses who had failed and gotten no help from the former president. And so this was like a big change in American history because, well, for a number of reasons. Number one, we're going to see like massive involvement of the federal government in regular people's lives, a fundamental shift in American government and federal responsibility for the people that they serve. The Relief Recovery Reform Acts are like mega involved in people's lives in a way that the federal government never had been before. The second reason why this is super important is this is the first time in modern American history when African Americans will vote for a Democrat. African Americans who had the ability to vote, largely not in southern states, up to this point, from the time of Abraham Lincoln in 1864, when he was running for re-election before his assassination, African Americans who could vote were voting for the Republican Party, and largely voted for the Republican Party from that time, from 1864 on until 1932. Those who could vote, again, remember, blacks being disenfranchised in many parts of America, mostly in the American South. So that block African American voting kind of swings toward the Democratic Party, and it has not left the Democratic Party since 1932. Even nowadays, most black Americans, not most, but many black Americans, kind of like the Democratic Party can kind of count on them as a block vote. This is of 2025, by the way. I should probably date this video. Okay, moving on. Election of 1960, almost done. Kennedy versus Nixon. Okay, so we're going to see Nixon again later when he's even older, but Kennedy ends up winning this one. He's a Democrat, Nixon is a Republican, and the reason why this one is important is because of the influence of media. It was the first to feature televised debates, although most Americans are still listening on the radio. So if you were listening on the radio, you would say that Nixon won. He's a little bit better spoken. His accent is not so thick, like JFK had that really thick Boston accent, kind of like New Englander. But if you were watching TV, you thought JFK won because the man's attractive, and he just has this charm about him that old Richard Nixon did not have. So public perception is like the key takeaway from this one. The Cold War, civil rights, the missile gap is what's called with the Soviet Union. Like, what are you going to do about our lack of technology versus the Soviet Union? Kennedy kind of has a narrow victory here, but at the time he was the youngest elected president and the first Catholic, and that was like big in the media because they were like, oh my gosh, our president serves the Pope, but like it's just a religion. But he was young, he had young children, he had a beautiful wife, and they called the White House Camelot. It just had this like mythological feel to it, the Kennedy presidency, and continued to because of the assassination and the conspiracy behind his assassination. But this election kind of shows the influence of media and new forms of media in presidential politics. All right, last one, election of 1980. Ronald Reagan, the Republican, defeats the incumbent Jimmy Carter, who was kind of seen as like a bleh. He had that malaise speech where he like blamed Americans for their own issues. We had economic stagnation, stagflation, which is high inflation and high unemployment rate, usually caused by negative supply shock, the Iran hostage crisis, just like a bunch, the OPEC oil embargo, just like poor Jimmy Carter was just like plagued with terrible things happening during his presidency. Reagan comes in this new conservative party, and he like gets this feeling that Americans are upset with the Democratic Party, and he rolls with it. So his new conservatism is all about reducing government regulation, a strong anti-communist, big old military, tax cuts for Americans. And it kind of shows this like swing towards conservatism in American politics. Ushers in this Reagan era, Reaganomics, the moral majority, more religion, evangelical Christians kind of taking over the Republican Party. And emphasizing like the government getting smaller, not being involved in people's lives or involved in the economy, much more free market, lower taxes. And it kind of marked a turning point in the Cold War strategy that like, we're going to be tough on the Cold War, ended up at the same time as the USSR kind of like destabilizing. And so Reagan is kind of seen as this like ending the Cold War hero with his like tough on communism kind of ideas.